All right, I guess I'll go ahead and start for now. I'm Jared. I'm Jason's co-instructor, and today we'll talk about monitoring, part of Module 3. And as people straggle in, they can catch up. We'll start by looking at, I guess, what's involved in monitoring, kind of how to determine what you want to monitor when you're installing a new application or a new service, and then we'll conclude with a question and answer session. If people have any questions on any topic, you can ask at that point. If you want to jump in, you can either through the chat or use *6 if you're on the phone to unmute yourself, or else if you're on the computer, click the microphone icon and you'll be able to jump in. So when the first consideration when you're installing some new application, you're setting up a new service on a server, of course, read the documentation. See if there are any recommendations in terms of what you should be monitoring with iSingo or whatever other monitoring suite you use. What kind of architecture the application uses. If you're installing WordPress, for example, you've got a web server component and you have a database component. Are these components on the same machine? You have different servers? Sometimes you'll have a database server on a different server, so you'll need to take that into account when you're monitoring to make sure that the database server is running, that the database service itself is listening, as well as the web server that's serving up WordPress. You might also have load balancing in front of it. It can get complicated. So make sure you know all the servers that are involved, all the different services that are being used by the application. When you're installing the application or service, take notes. Note what you've installed where, any dependencies that may have been installed and launched. Check on what ports have been opened up on the server that it may be listening to, what services you started up. As I mentioned before, you'll have a web server, you'll have a database server if it's WordPress. If you're installing something else, then it might be a JServe or Tomcat application server. So just make note of all the components that go into the application that you're installing. Look at the processes that are running after you've started the application. You can use PS-EF will show you everything that's running on the system, so you can check for something new or just grep for the name of the service that you're running. Sort of before and after, using a diff even would be a good idea to make sure that you know what services are running on the server after you've installed this new application. Also check to see if there were any new users created by the installation. If you're installing Apache, for example, the Apache web server, part of that installation process will usually install a new user named HTTPD or Apache, depending on the distribution you're on. So if you do a tail on Etsy password, then that will show you if any new users have been installed on there. You can check, do an ls-l Etsy password to see if it got modified recently. And you could, if there is a new user, if you run ps-fu, that will give you a full listing of any applications that are any processes that are being run by this new user. So if you've just installed Apache and HTTPD is that new user that shows up, ps-fu HTTPD will give you a listing of any services that are being run by that new user. You can also check the network ports to, you can do a before and after on that as well. If you have that user you're looking for, or the process name you're looking for, if you run netstat-nutp or nutlp, then that will display a numerical listing of all the, I guess, the IP addresses and the ports that different processes are listening to on the system. And you can either just get the full list and look at it, or you can grep for a particular program to see what ports that program is listening to. So if you grep HTTPD, then you'll see all the ports that the HTTPD process is listening to. LSOF is a program that will show you, I guess, open files on the system by using the I option with it, and along with lowercase n, capital P. That will give you a list of the open network files, internet files, sockets that are open on the system. NP is just a way to limit how much it's going to look up for each item, so you don't have to wait for DNS to resolve if it's going to show you those files. So Netstat and LSOF are great tools for keeping track of what network ports and IP addresses these applications would be listening to. And that kind of sums it up. The main thing to bear in mind is when you're installing a new application or a new service on a server, pay attention to its documentation, pay attention to what its dependencies are and what other processes it might depend on. Check for a new user at the end of the password file, and see if that user is running any new processes, and see what kind of sort of network ports and IP addresses may have been opened up by that new application, and take all those into account when you're setting up monitoring for the application. And with that, does anyone have any questions? I probably rushed through it a bit, and some people came in late, so yeah, shoot away. And I know it takes time to mute, but if anybody missed it, yeah, if you are on the phone, you can use *6. I think or what was it, #6? No, I think it's *6 to unmute yourself. Or if you're on the computer, you can click on the microphone icon to unmute, or just use the chat. Another call. Any questions? Can be about anything you've been running into, or just anything you've been curious about. Doesn't have to be just about monitoring. All right. Well, seeing that it's quiet, I guess we'll go ahead and we'll call it there. Nice short session. But yeah, if you, of course, you have access to the forums. If you, oh, hang on, I have a question. Does monitoring use a lot of CPU? So can I just spin up a VM? It usually doesn't. You can often run a program like iSinga or another monitoring tool on the same server as a service. And ideally, you want to keep it separate, so that way, if say you have a web server running, if you have the monitoring service running on a different server, then if the web server goes down, like if the entire machine goes down, then at least iSinga or whatever monitor is still running on that other server. So yeah, it doesn't have, you don't have a performance impact generally from running it on the same machine, but it's a sort of as an extra bit of redundancy. You can put it on a different server so that if the web server goes down, at least iSinga is still active and reporting back to you. Can iSinga monitor all operating systems? The way that iSinga operates is usually by listening to ports, by trying to send a signal to a remote server, for example. So you give it a URL, for example, and it will see if it gets a response from a web server when it tries to visit the URL. So in that sense, yeah, if you're running, you can run a web server, for example, on Windows. You can run it on Mac, Linux. To us, iSinga, it's not going to matter. If you're running it iSinga on a Linux server, all it's doing is just sending a request to that URL or checking to see if there's an open port on the remote server or whatever else you code it to check for. So yeah, it is able then to monitor any other operating system. If you're usually the idea is that it's going to have some sort of a port listening on the server that'll tell you whether it's running, whether it's responding properly. So as long as you set up the test properly, it doesn't matter what the operating system is remotely. Good. Yeah, monitoring is definitely nice like that. It's, I mean, you're essentially emulating to some extent a user of the system. Even if it's not necessarily anything complicated, you can be as simple as just checking to see if the main landing page is responsive. Sometimes if you have like a web application running behind the scenes, you might have it set up to answer certain queries so that you would give it a URL where you just expect a certain sort of response that the user would see. So yeah, it's nice and flexible like that. Next question. Which tasks do you decide to automate when dealing with servers? For example, is there a script that allows you to find errors easier without looking through all the log files but extracting important data? Um, I guess yeah, it is definitely going to depend on the application. What sort of server, also whether it's development or production, you're going to be more strict about how you're going to work with a production server than something in development. But Yeah, I mean, there are using something like let's see. I've written just basic shell scripts that will just grab a log that runs periodically through cron that might send me a message if it sees something alarming. So I mean, a lot of the so as far as certainly as far as monitoring goes, that's usually harmless. So I might have if I don't have something nice and fancy like Isinga going on, I might just have something as simple as a program called VMstat running periodically that collects just statistics about the operating system, and it'll tell me whether memory's low or whether the CPU is being used heavily, and then I can just set up a shell script or even a Python script that checks those results, and I'll have it set up to send me an email or a text if there's something that's a little that kind of close to wrong. That way I can head off problems before they happen, especially on a production server. You want to be careful. You don't want to run out of memory. You don't want to have anything go down. So you check it when thresholds get up to 80% or so. We'll jump in on that. Oh yeah, Python can. Yeah, Python is. I rather like Python for its text processing. So I mean, shell scripts are nice and portable. They'll run on any system. You don't need to worry about installing something extra to get them running. But yeah, you can set up some Python scripts that will I can run a lot of the checks that Isinga would from just not as nice an interface as you'd get with something like Isinga or yeah. But yeah, that's yeah, I can't think offhand of a specific script that I'd necessarily run. There are definitely suites out there that let you monitor on a server, and you'll see some of that over the course of this course. And giving time to type, see if anyone else has a question. How to deal with backups on a Linux server, and what methods do you prefer? Uh, that's Another that'll kind of depend on the situation. Like if it's a small business, then I mean you can back up to something like to a service like Dropbox or to AWS from Amazon. That's a nice and reliable place to back up files. If you're dealing with a larger enterprise where you're trying to deal with on-site and off-site backups and stuff, there you might even still be using tape, which would be unusual, but it's still actually pretty possible. It's especially at some companies, they have something that works, they don't want to change it, so you will run into some of the older hardware. If it's a tape drive, you might be using dump, you might be using, there are commercial suites for backing things up from Linux as well. So yeah, again, it kind of depends. You might have, I mean, it's possible to set up something like an NFS share where you're copying files as you basically as you create them in one area, you copy them to the other. That's usually not super reliable, but it's easy to set up. So it does yeah, it can depend on your needs, how strict you need everything to be. Usually you'll use probably a combination of things. You'll have something sort of an ongoing backup that where you're trying to copy all the files as they happen to someplace really convenient, even if it's just a second drive on the system in case the first drive fails. And then you might have a nightly setup that will a script that'll run that will copy things to a remote server, maybe even something in another country, so you've got a serious backup somewhere else off-site. So yeah, it definitely will depend on the resources of the company and how much data you're backing up. I've been supporting Linux for a long time. Do you have a favorite distro? I am kind of neutral on the distribution thing, actually. Back when I started out, I guess I started at a small internet service provider with Linux and a bunch of other enthusiasts there, and so we actually set up a website that tracked Linux distributions and made it easier to download ISO images. This was at a time when it was kind of hard, a little harder. DistroWatch was only just getting started at about the same time, so it wasn't as easy to get this collection of new distributions as they popped up. So kind of maintaining that site kept me kind of neutral on it. So there are things I like about Debian, Ubuntu, CentOS, Fedora. Arch is kind of fun. I've supported that. SUSE. So yeah, they've all got things to recommend them. So it's hard for me to pick a favorite. Like I think I might lean a little bit toward maybe Debian, just out of fond memories. They supported Macs sooner than some of the others. So I started on them sooner than I did on some of the Fedora or some of the Red Hat type distributions. But no, they're all pretty good. They've all got their uses. They all have their specializations too. So it's kind of a matter of finding the right tool for the job. So you can find some good documentation for Arch, and it takes care of some nice stuff. If you want to go crazy with customization, you might get Gentoo and be able to customize what kind of compile flags and compile everything that gets installed. It can be pretty insane. But yeah, no, they're all good. CentOS is good for being a free version of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, essentially, so that it's more compatible with enterprise software. Can be more familiar to people who, if you're going to get a Red Hat certification or the like. So it has that advantage. Fedora is a lot like that, but it's more cutting edge. So yeah, there's a reason that there are so many distributions out there, and that's because there are so many different needs they can cover. I want to install CentOS on my old HP box, but I was only able to find an image that is 7 gigs, which is too big for disk. Am I missing something? Is there a small image available? There is. You might have to dig around. Let me get over to CentOS's webpage here and see if I can find it. But usually you've got a big download button, and if you look around in the download area, let's see if I can find a link for the smaller, let's see. Well, if you click on, yeah, if you go to the CentOS website, click on Get CentOS Now, there's a DVD ISO, Everything ISO, and Minimal ISO. So click on that Minimal ISO link, and that'll give you a list of mirrors. Let me link it here for 64-bit. And if you look around, there'll be a 32-bit as well. Usually, if you look for an other link, things along those. Basically, if you dig enough on their websites, you'll be able to find it. But yeah, the minimal ISO image, what that'll do is give you an installer that has very little on it, and then you can pick and choose what you want to install. So you can install at that point a really bare bones system, like leave off the GUI, for example, and that'll give you a nice simple Linux system. Or you can go with just a more minimal system. I mean, like a GUI with well, actually, just most of the GUIs, if you install just the base system, it should still come in under 7 gigs. So, okay, then yeah, just a minimal install will work. You might not even need all of the server options for that. Just because the nice thing about using Linux, especially with a package-based system, is you can install a very minimal system and then use Yum to select, okay, I want to install Lysinga, I want to install Apache or whatever, and it'll install all the packages those depend on. We use Vagrant for local environments for testing. Can Vagrant be used for production as well? Is it popular among experts? I've seen different opinions on it. I haven't used it in a production environment myself, but I have seen especially developers really like it, because what Vagrant can do for you is you set up a Vagrant file, you have a central repository where you keep the box that everyone uses, and then when somebody new comes on the team, or if you make a change, you give them the Vagrant file and they can set it up from there. You can make a change to the box image, and that gets proliferated to all the developers so that everyone's using the same environment. So it's really good for that. It can I could certainly see its use for a production environment if you're using virtual machines to host an application, because again, that is an advantage in that you can make changes quickly by just changing a base image and then reloading Vagrant to have it pick up the changes. I guess one thing I would say about Vagrant is it kind of depends on, I guess, what it's working with. Some people have complained that it changes often enough and sometimes uses sort of non-standard hooks for something like VirtualBox, so that a new version of VirtualBox comes out and that breaks the connection Vagrant had with it. So you have to be careful about matching the version of Vagrant up to the version of VirtualBox or VMware or whatever service you're using to provide the virtualization. So that's something to watch out for if you're looking at it for a production environment. Obviously, that's not quite as much of an issue for development, because if the update breaks it, you can usually roll back pretty quickly, and it doesn't affect things too badly if you're down for a few minutes. Do you know how hosting providers automate installation of their VMs? Um, let's see. Well, I guess it. Yeah, I keep saying it depends, which is always feels like a cop out, but it does depend. The last place that personally, the last place I worked that was a hosting provider was Rackspace, which uses they have cloud instances. They're running what's called OpenStack on the back end. So the way that that works is that you have kind of this layer that manages what machines are available, and then it portions out slices of those machines to people when they create a new instance. So the way that so that automation is handled by the OpenStack layer, that it's got an API and everything, so they can run scripts, or they can have a web interface where they make the request and then a virtual machine gets created out of the pool that's been assigned to the cloud. And the same thing happens if you set up a virtual private cloud with OpenStack or a similar service. It's Red Hat's part of that. Yeah, it actually it was originally a project at NASA that a guy from a friend of mine actually for Rackspace found this running at this guy at NASA who had been uh, kind of trying to solve their problem of how to create virtual machines on demand. And meanwhile, over at Rackspace, they had some software that was good, but he wanted to clean that up. So he had found this this guy at NASA doing something really interesting. So we went to them with a proposal and went to Rackspace's leadership, and then they brought other companies on board like Red Hat to say, hey, let's make this system that's open source so that none of us have control over it, so that it's free, and that way it'll be a nice open source solution that will compete with any commercial packages that come out along the lines, along down the line rather. So yeah, Red Hat is involved in that, and they do support it. As I mentioned, yeah, Rackspace, I think HP has worked with it. I'm not sure who's in on the OpenStack consortium right now, but yeah, that is one of the many options that are out there for if you are a hosting provider and you're trying to provide these instances. Obviously, Amazon has their own backend that they work with. I'm not sure what DigitalOcean is using these days, but yeah. Would that be the next step of learning after finishing this class? Man, I wouldn't jump right into something like OpenStack just because, I mean, you certainly could. Setting up a little private cloud would be an interesting project, but it's the sort of thing that would involve a lot of resources, and you can't virtualize something like that really easily. Like you couldn't. I guess maybe you possibly could, but I wouldn't try to. Maybe you try to set up an OpenStack instance, for example, on a bunch of Amazon VMs. That probably wouldn't work out too well. You'd probably need the physical hardware, but you could get an rent a private cloud if you wanted to try to work on it. Mostly after this class, I guess what I do is just play around on servers. You'd want to be more familiar. It'd probably be more useful to first focus on certain applications. So certainly web servers see common use, databases. So try setting up WordPress for yourself, for example. Get that running on a server. Try install it. If you get used to installing plugins and things, that gets you used to a multi-layered application. After that, you might want to look into things like load balancing, where you have an application distributed across multiple servers. So having a reverse proxy in front of, sitting in front on one server, and then behind it you have two web servers, and then behind the two web servers you have one database server that they share, something like that. If you set up a kind of a little complicated network like that, that'll get you used to what you'll usually see in an enterprise environment. It's also useful in a smaller environment for that matter. Small businesses, you'll want that level of redundancy too. Yeah, it can certainly seem that way, and it does. Load balancing does take getting used to, and especially when you consider security issues. When you're, oh yes, a reverse proxy does sound crazy, and it's a reverse proxy is, you think of it like kind of a caching server for the web servers behind it. So one service it can provide is just if a visitor comes to your site, you have this what they call a reverse proxy, like, oh blast it, I can't, my mind's blanking on the name of it. Starts with a V. Anyway, that server sits there, receives the connection, and then decides which of the two servers behind it it'll pass it back to. And you can set it up with a bunch of different algorithms, like just distribute them equally, or maybe one server's more capable than the other, so you might pass most of them to one server instead of the other. And if one of them goes down, they can still pass stuff back to the one that's still running. Then the one nice thing you can do, Varnish, that's the name. I knew I'd come up with it. The Varnish reverse proxy, for example, is nice because it will also cache static files, so that instead of having WordPress, for example, generating a file every time somebody comes for a visit, then you can have that proxy try to take those static files and put them up front, so that if somebody is just requesting an image that never changes, then you've got Varnish handing it off to them rather than bothering the web servers behind it. So that's something that you can look into after this class as a more complicated but very useful tool that you can use to set up redundant web applications, so that if one server goes down, you've got something else covering for it. And to some extent, yeah, you do need to worry about networking there, but usually it's going to be an admin a Linux admin who's going to set up Vagrant, would set up Varnish and just set up the configuration, telling it this IP address is one of the web servers, this IP address is the other web server. So yeah, networking is certainly a part of it because you're going to be worrying about firewalls and where things are located. That Varnish has to be accessible from the outside, but then you'd only want Varnish to pass connections back to the web server rather than letting anyone connect directly to the web server. So at that point, it's definitely more of a networking issue. Yes, yes, it is. Varnish is open source. Sure. In case you can't tell, I've tended to work more with the website of things on servers, so that's what springs most immediately to mind. If you get into an enterprise level position, then a lot of times you've got somebody who specifically handles the databases, for example. So I haven't, while I can certainly set up a database server and work with it, usually there's been somebody around who knows so much more about them than me. So I can't speak quite as well to the nitty gritty of setting up MySQL so that it's optimized and using the right engine and everything. So yeah, that's going to be something, especially if you're at a smaller business or a medium-sized business, you'll be expected to be responsible for more of that, and you'll have more opportunity to delve into performance issues specific to database servers as opposed to being able to pawn them off on some other really smart guy. I'm I'm good at it. I used to be better, I guess, is what I'll say. I haven't worked with it directly for a little while, so I haven't dug around in its internals, but I am pretty good at it, I guess, is how I'll say it. Um, Thank you. Yes, I qualify things a lot. I don't want to get in over my head and then say something dumb, but yeah, there are considerations in Apache when you're trying to set up it for performance. So you can just set up Apache with a default configuration, slap in whatever modules you need, and just let it run. But there are performance tools you can run against it to try to optimize it. There are different sort of, well, I'll call them engines that I guess thread models that it can use that you can switch between that will work better depending on what your application needs. So yeah, there's a lot to know about different things. So you can end up as an admin maybe specializing in an application and getting especially used to what its quirks are and what different base, especially what the causes of different problems can be. But there's also a lot of utility to being a generalist who understands how these applications work together and letting someone else, like I said, let someone else worry more about getting the database optimized so that you can kind of focus on making sure that the database will work together with the application running on the application server, be it Tomcat or Webster or whatever, and that's talking to Apache, and that Varnish is sitting in front of it and communicating with Apache, and that the load balancing is working and all that fun stuff. You get used to it. Sure. Happy to share. It is. I mean, over time you'll pick stuff up, obviously, but yeah, luckily nobody expects you to be an expert in everything. Not if they're realistic, anyway. It's a worthy goal. Yeah, it's good to try for it, but yeah, yeah. Don't be too hard on yourself if you don't know everything. That's always a good life rule. I'll start with the first one. WordPress is something I want to learn after I finish this course. Want to freelance websites and apps. Okay, that's a good goal. WordPress is a nice place to start because it's well documented. So you do have multiple parts to it, so that gives you some experience working with the most common elements of a LAMP stack, the database, Apache, and PHP. So yeah, WordPress is definitely a good place to start. And Docker, is it good for using different applications on the same server? Yes, it is. I haven't gotten to use it in production. I played with it sort of on my own, but yeah, no, it's really good for that. Being able to set up an application, have it be self-contained. Yeah, Docker's really nice for being able to quickly deploy something and without needing to worry about the environment it's being deployed to. Yeah, Docker would be lighter than a virtual machine because it's this self-contained environment. It just has what it needs essentially. So yeah, that can have a smaller footprint on a server. The downside, of course, is that when you separate that stuff out, specialize it, then sometimes you might need to juggle a few things around to make components work together. Should I understand always every command or config that I write? Ooh, it's nice. I mean, a lot of times it can be a good idea to, if you're going through some instructions, look up what it does. You check the man page maybe, depending on what it is. You don't always need to know necessarily all the ramifications of a change. Like, for example, if you're setting up WordPress, there might be might need to change there's a PHP setting for the maximum file size that can be uploaded. So, yeah, you don't need to necessarily understand all the ramifications of that. Just sort of as long as you're setting it to something reasonable, and your application isn't going to involve somebody uploading something bigger than the disk size or something like that. When we're dealing with Isinga, I didn't understand config. Ah, I guess for the purposes of setting it up, the way that I usually like to look at something like Isinga, if it's a new application to me, is if you go through these exercises, these tutorials, um, get it running first. So yeah, if you don't completely understand every element of the configuration, that's okay as long as you get to the point where it's running. Because once it's running, you know what it looks like when things work. That's a good baseline to start from. Once you have that working, then you can go back and you can review the configuration changes you made. You can look at the documentation of the software, maybe look at someone else's tutorial if you want to do something specific and they've written it up. That way you understand things a little bit better. You'll by knowing what your goal looks like, then you'll be able to recognize it if you do something wrong when you go and fiddle with that configuration and try to change it to something else. I mean, personally, when I've written documentation for some applications, my favorite approach is, I'll maybe follow the documentations tutorial, I'll follow a regular tutorial, get things up running, and then I'll see how I can break it. Try to figure out how somebody would normally go in and maybe misunderstand something, so that I can head that off in my documentation and say, look out for this part. Uh, and a lot of times that just comes from me not necessarily understanding something when I go in and try to change that configuration, and then change it until I figure out, okay, that is what that does, and then be able to share that with someone else. So yeah, to me, it comes down to experimentation. Different people learn different ways. I mean, just poring over the documentation can probably teach you pretty well too, instead of sort of the blind breaking things. But that's the advantage of having virtual machines and cloud instances available. You can start stuff up, you can mess around with it, and if it breaks, you can just start over again without really losing too much. Do I like gaming? I do actually. I actually have a PC for my desktop and a Mac for my laptop. So the PC mostly is because of gaming, because it's configurable, and also because it was for a while there it was easier to put Linux on a PC than a Mac. And yeah, and the Mac because I honestly like the interface a whole lot better than Windows. And then Linux is a good general tool, usually for servers. So, but yeah, I do enjoy computer gaming. A lot of RPGs, some MMOs, but yeah, I've dabbled in all the genres. I guess I'm getting old though. Being in my 40s means I don't keep up with the kids as well anymore. So I don't play the really competitive stuff anymore. I admit I haven't messed with gaming on Linux a lot since I focused mostly on servers on there, but it certainly seems like they've made some great strides in just get, especially in the indie games. A lot of them are building for Linux now because they've got the tools for it. So that's nice and inclusive. Yeah, yeah, you can play a lot of stuff on Linux now, and that's good. Gotten to where a lot of times I know certainly Kickstarters for new games. A lot of times that's one of the questions people will ask them is, "Are you going to have a Linux version?" So yeah, Linux is making good inroads on the desktop and into gaming, which is good to see. Can you recommend a decent lab setup for learning like Linux, Varnish, reverse proxy, hardware and software? Well, Vagrant is I think Vagrant's pretty nice to use for something like that. You can set up a Vagrant file with multiple servers in it, for example, or multiple VMs. You can put them into a private network and define the networking inside that configuration, and then use that to recreate the whole environment if you need to. And you can use that then to define, 3 servers and be able to test. Okay, let me set up this first server with a public network and a private network, and set these other 2 servers up with private networks that connect to the first one. And then once you've set everything up with Varnish and a couple web servers serving things up, you can then connect to the public network on the one Varnish server, and make sure that you check the logs on the other 2 web servers to make sure they're getting accesses when you reload the page again and again. So or to make sure that you turn off the caching, of course, on Varnish before that happens, so you're actually getting back to the servers behind it. That's a consideration. But I'm overcomplicating this answer now. Yes, Vagrant is I find a pretty nice tool for that. I've you can also, if you're willing to put the money into it, go into AWS or DigitalOcean or Rackspace or the like, DreamHost, and set up some instances. They usually have a load balancing services that you can use, so that you can save yourself the trouble of setting that up, so that you can just test to see that you understand how a load balancer works with the web servers before trying to set up your own load balancing system with Varnish, things like that. So there are definitely options. But yeah, Vagrant seems with VirtualBox seems like the really nice and cheap and easy way to go right now. How to test a server if you know that many users are going to use it, but you don't have real people that will test it. There are applications you can find that. Oh, blasted! My mind's blanking again on load testing software. Um, but yeah, if you look for load testing software, I know that Apache comes with one that where you can just simulate a whole bunch of connections to the web server. Um, but there are more complicated testing suites out there as well, of course. Some of them free, some of them not. The idea is generally that you run this as software to simulate a large load, either by hitting the same URL again and again and again, so that you're using up memory and using CPU time on the system to make sure that it can handle that level of load that you expect. The more complicated testing tools would let you walk through a series of steps. Like it can be, if you're setting up an online banking system and you're trying to test that, then usually just one URL isn't going to be able to do it. You'd want to simulate a full user experience where they log in and then they perform a transaction and log off. So that's where the more complicated suites come in. But in general, the idea is that, yeah, you find something that will hammer the system with multiple connections, kind of like a denial of service attack, except you're not really trying to deny the service. You're just trying to make sure that the service will be able to hold up under the number of connections that you expect. So yeah, that's basically real people can be simulated. There we go. JMeter is one I was thinking of. Apache has a software called JMeter that can be pretty good for load testing a server. So that's one that's good to look into. Apache Bench as well. I think it's AB. Yeah, yeah. The AB command I think usually gets installed with Apache. I could be wrong on that. It might be a separate package, but that's a quick and dirty way to just hammer one URL over and over from another system and see how it holds up. Great. They've already found solutions for most of the things. Yeah, yeah, that is a nice thing that has developed over time. I've noticed that yeah, they're as people have run into these problems, they've come up with their own solutions for it. And there's usually a free approach and a commercial approach, and the commercial approach is usually going to be better supported and might be able to do fancier things. But a lot of times you can get by with the open source, and by get by I mean sometimes it's completely awesome software that tops the commercial stuff that's out there. So it's a good situation to be in as a server administrator. I like this course because it tackles situations where you deal with multiple servers. That's good. Yeah, I'm glad you like it. Uh, Jason deserves the credit. For those who came in late, I'm Jared. I'm Jason's co-instructor. He's the one who designed the course, so he gets the full credit for setting it up with multiple servers and some nice real world situations, essentially. But yeah, I'm glad that is considered a good thing about the course, because I like that about it too. Let's see. Well, let me start with if there are no questions about these topics, I would like to chat about peer-to-peer. All right, well, I'll hold off and see what the other question is. Sorry it took almost a year to finally pull the trigger and sign up. Thanks for not giving up on me. I like the way the emails were sent. Oh, yeah, no problem. Happy to keep at you. On peer-to-peer, I can talk about it some. I haven't said. I mean, I've used certainly services like BitTorrent for file transfer. Large file transfer is pretty nice. Um, I guess peer-to-peer in what sense? I guess would be the question. I mean, peer-to-peer is certainly an interesting technology for being able to distribute loads across multiple systems, across multiple networks, things like that. It's always going to depend on kind of the application and what you're trying to do with it. Well, I recently realized that for most peer-to-peer applications, you need some kind of relays between peers. Yeah, yeah, you can. I know that I mean, I guess actually one example of peer-to-peer kind of done badly is since we mentioned games earlier, was a game that tried to do it set up its networking that way. Tried to have a server sort of set up the initial game and then let the clients, the game clients, do peer-to-peer networking so that the server wouldn't be a bottleneck. But unfortunately, that the way that that worked out was trying to pass this information between all the clients meant that the slowest client would then be the bottleneck, and usually clients were slower than servers. So that ended up being a poor implementation of a peer-to-peer networking solution. Because I'd be playing with some friends, and one of them would actually be in Granada, and so she'd be thousands of miles away and slowing the rest of us down as we were all trying to play. So yeah, it's always a matter of picking the right tool and the right approach for whatever the problem is you're trying to solve. But yeah, I couldn't tell you much about specifically how to implement it in a way that makes sense for things. I can tell you about some of the applications that are there, but yeah, I'm not as much of a low level coder. So well, I'm just interested in how to use such applications. I'm still clueless about some implementations. So am I. So that's a fine place to be. As we said before, you can't really know everything. It's a nice goal, but yeah, that's something that hopefully you can pick up in time. This focusing on the server side of things means that you're not going to necessarily implement peer-to-peer software quite as often, unless it's to solve a specific goal. So somebody's written some software for, or otherwise you've got developers in house who are writing the solution, so they can help you make sure that the server is optimized to use it properly, be able to support it and everything. But yeah, a lot of times, certainly file transfers for peer-to-peer is you'll see that. There are. I mean, that's really the main one so far that I've seen anyway, has been file transfers. But yeah, it's got potential. It's just a matter of finding ways to get it to work without having one peer be a bottleneck. Be able to adapt the network quickly as people drop in and join. Oh, isn't it? I told you I don't know everything. No, I believe you. And yeah, yeah, looks like it is. So there's a cool tool. And I'm sorry because I didn't to read it for those not in the chat. WebRTC is a peer-to-peer. It's a JavaScript communication protocol. We're focusing on the server side with this class. How hard or easy is it to learn the desktop side? It's actually not as hard as you'd think on the desktop side. I mean, you would want to learn the shell is a good idea, but I know that I've set up for just a friend who knew nothing about computers, but her computer crashed. She lost her Windows installation. She didn't have a license, so I ended up setting up I forget, I think an Ubuntu on set up Ubuntu on her system. She didn't understand what I was talking about. Not very computer literate and everything. So I just heard back from another friend a while later that yeah, I don't know what you did, but she says that she gave her computer to you to fix, and when you gave it back, it ran like 5 times as fast as anything she'd ever seen it done before, and it was just great. So she never really knew the difference between Linux and Windows in that case. She just all she used it for was web browsing, email, and using OpenOffice really. So yeah, she didn't need to know much about the desktop. So yeah, it's good to see that Linux got to that point where it's user friendly enough that that somebody who doesn't know about a lot about computers can still figure out, well, this is the web browser, this is how I get to Word, and this is how I print a file. So yeah, the desktop side is pretty good. Now, if you're trying to do something more complicated, like if you want to be a gamer and you want to be able to launch Windows programs that aren't written for Linux, then you're getting into emulation and Wine, and that can be flaky for some programs and difficult for others. So there, and sometimes you'll run into issues with drivers where you'll get a new video card and the driver doesn't support Linux very well, or maybe the company in question doesn't do a good job with its Linux drivers. This can sometimes happen with like wireless adapters and things. So there's still more issues with Linux, perhaps on the desktop as Windows, but yeah, in general, it's just fine at the desktop level. Servers we focus on because a lot of times, if you're working at a company and you're running a server, you're going to be trying to optimize it. You're going to be monitoring it. You're going to be trying to make sure that you're squeezing as much performance out of it as you can, because your goal is 100% uptime, because if the server goes down, then chances are your storefront goes down too, so you lose business or whatever the application is. So yeah, that does make the servers a little harder than the desktops because there's more at stake. And we're at the hour, but I'll stick around as long as it takes for any other questions anyone might have. Otherwise, as mentioned, there are the forums, so feel free to ask us any questions you have. Pop into the forums. Jason and I can help. Other students can help. That's always a nice thing about forums, is you've got other people to give you a hand, and plus the answers are archived there for other people to find. I'm out of questions. Okay. All right. Well, good. Means you've learned all you want to for now. That's a good thing. Is there a final due date for the courses? I'm honestly not sure. I guess Jason tends to know more about the scheduling and things than I do. I'm more for sort of the technical assistance. So I do know that the forums we continue to monitor. So I don't think we ever kick you out of there. So you can always ask questions. You can always follow along the exercises. In his shell script course, you can send in submissions at any time. There's no cutoff that I've seen that stops you from sending them in, and we certainly don't check the submissions to see if somebody's still in the active course. So no, as far as I'm pretty sure that as far as we're concerned, there isn't really a final due date, and you can take your time. I think mostly it's the calls that would be on a schedule. So yeah, I think so. To my knowledge, you're not going to get locked out of the forum. Yeah, there's yeah the Linux forums are, I believe they're always up there. I know that he's had former students act as moderators for him and everything. So yeah, to my knowledge, you won't get shut out of the forums. And again, we might confirm that with Jason just because yeah, it's just a question I've never actually asked him. So I'm just getting started. Is Red Hat the best to use on VirtualBox for this class? It's yeah. I guess CentOS is what I'll say instead of Red Hat, because Red Hat you can install, but it expects you to have a license with Red Hat in order to get the latest and greatest software and everything. So CentOS is basically Red Hat without the commercial software included. So it tries to be an open source equivalent. Uh, the only reason I'd say that, yeah, that's probably the best one for this course is because it's the example that Jason uses for the exercises, for the lectures, and any demos he does. He uses CentOS because that's closer to the enterprise Linux that a lot of the bigger companies will use. But yeah, you'll be able to, if you prefer a different distribution, then a different distribution will usually work too. If you're installing, if you get us like a CentOS image and you're trying to install from the DVD or from a VDI, select Red Hat if you want to install CentOS. As far as VirtualBox is concerned, there's not as much of a difference that it causes any problems. So you tell it it's Red Hat and it'll work just fine. Same thing if you have Ubuntu or Mint or Debian, then yeah, you can select Debian or Ubuntu in that list, and that'll work fine with Mint or any other Debian-based distributions. With Vagrant, can we download other versions of Linux for learning? Yeah, yeah. If you go to I think it's vagrantup.com. HashiCorp maintains a collection of images that you can search through. Jason's images, in fact, are in that archive. So yeah, there other people have uploaded their own boxes that to work with VirtualBox. I think some that they've uploaded some for VMware as well that you can use with Vagrant. My question is, how do I find CentOS to create your virtual machine? I'm looking at it now, and there's no CentOS option. If you're, well, I guess, are you using? Is this for this is for VirtualBox, right? That you've launched VirtualBox, you've created a new virtual machine, and then it asks you what type of virtual machine you're creating. So at that point, you presumably either have, I guess, have you downloaded an install image or a virtual disk image that you're going to use with VirtualBox, or is that not a step that you've gotten to yet? Okay, so yeah, what you'll want to do is you can go to someplace like osboxes.org and you can get what's called a VDI, a virtual disk image that you can use with VirtualBox, and they've got VDIs for different operating systems, and you don't have to go there. You can also get an installer disk from CentOS's website or from Ubuntu's website or whatever. Once you have that, then you set up your VM and you select the type that matches what you want to install, because what VirtualBox will do there is that selection doesn't actually install Red Hat, it doesn't actually install Windows or whatever. It just sets up the box so that it's has specs that would match a typical Linux box or Windows box at that point. So yeah, you'd go through, you'd create your virtual machine, you'd select Red Hat, and then you either create a blank VDI if you're going to be using an ISO to install from, or else you tell it you want to select the VDI to use as a virtual disk, and then you navigate to this virtual disk that you've downloaded and unpacked. And once you select that, like as I said, if you go to osboxes.org, download a CentOS VDI, and then create a VM, select Red Hat 64-bit as the type, and then select that VDI as the disk drive for the new machine, and it should boot right into it. If it's OS Boxes, then I think the username is OS Boxes, and then the password is osboxes.org. It'll display it in the login, so that's easy to remember. You select, well, you'd select Linux, and then you'd select for say if it's CentOS, you would select Red Hat 64-bit usually. I believe we should, yeah. Try to remember if there's a post in the forums that describes it. I know there's a blog post that talks about a little bit about using VirtualBox. I can dig up if you want more information on that, post in the forums, and I can respond with links and a little more of a tutorial if you have trouble. Okay. Yeah. Because I know Jason's written some stuff up, so yeah, I'll find that. I'm making a note of that. All right. We have any other questions? Give you a moment. You ever upgrade Linux kernel in production? Ooh, that's always a tough choice to make, because I mean you certainly there because I guess on the one hand, a lot of times there are going to be security updates, so you do want to get the security patches into production as quickly as you can to make sure that nobody takes advantage of your production server. But at the same time, yeah, installing a kernel involves usually rebooting the system. That's downtime, so you want to try to orchestrate it so that you have load balancing going on so that other servers are picking up the slack. You want to thoroughly test the new kernel in a development environment or a prototyping environment so that you can catch any potential problems there, make sure that all your software works with the new version of the kernel. So yeah, usually you usually don't do a major kernel upgrade. You might do a minor version level upgrade to get whatever fixes and patches that go along with that in there, but you don't necessarily, if you've got a production system, you're usually not going to want the new features that come along with a major kernel upgrade. So yeah, just like with any software in production, you're usually going to be really conservative and really cautious unless you're doing a major upgrade to your application. So you end up with DOS. Yeah, sometimes. I worked at a bank in the early 2000s where they still had, and I don't know what their setup is now, but their financial back end storing all the records were on mainframes. So they still had mainframes running and had guys who knew COBOL back there working with them. So yeah, a lot of these companies can be very conservative. They had some machines. I think their ATMs were running OS2. If anybody old remembers OS2, that was totally a thing for a while. So yeah, you really can have DOS and BASIC running at some of these companies if they've got a system that's just considered too important to replace, and that they don't want to put so it's been working just fine so far. Don't mess with it. Don't change it. Don't spend tons of money on it. Yeah, I can see hospitals doing that too. Yep. So yeah, even knowing some of the older tech can be useful sometimes, because you'll find places that are probably still using token ring networking and all kinds of stuff. Yeah. Yep. I used OS2 for yeah, for the ATMs. I don't know if they had it anywhere else by the time I left there, but yeah, the ATMs, they still had that behind the scenes. Okay. Well, I guess that looks like it. Of course, the moment somebody hits enter, I'll probably be proven wrong and it'll be time for another question, but that's why I'm talking and rambling a little bit just to give them time to finish writing out their sentence. But it looks like we're done. So, okay. Yeah. Glad you enjoyed it. And yeah, I agree. Everyone have a good evening. And remember, go to the forums if you have any questions. We're always there for you. And yeah, have fun with the course and have a good evening. Happy to help. And ending it. See you guys later.